All right, settle in, folks, because global trade, that normally sleepy topic discussed by people in slightly too shiny suits, has decided to become a full-blown, high-stakes cage match. And in early 2025, France, yes, the country of exquisite cheese and existential size, decided to fire back at US tariffs with a counterstrike so bold it made global markets spill their collective morning coffee. It was less ooh la la and more oh dear God, what now? This wasn't just another diplomatic handbag slap over imports. It was the kind of moment that makes economists nervously adjust their bow ties and start muttering about paradigm shifts. What initially looked like your standard issue garden variety escalation in tariff disputes, I tax your steel, you tax my soybeans, we all feel vaguely annoyed, quickly ballooned into something much, much bigger. We're talking the kind of geopolitical drama that could not only reshape alliances forged over decades, but also send entire industries, particularly the car industry, into a tailspin. Here at Power and Policy, we're diving headfirst into this unfolding mess across the Atlantic, where the European Union, with France basically shouting en garde from the front lines, is frantically re-evaluating its entire economic playbook under some pretty intense American pressure. And let me be clear, this isn't just some petty squabble over who makes the best steel or aluminum. Though, spoiler alert, tariffs make steel and aluminum more expensive and annoying to deal with. No, this is bigger. We've identified 7, yes, critical factors at play here. And we're going to break down exactly how France's rather muscular response could fundamentally alter the balance of power in international trade. More importantly, for many of you, we'll explore what this all means for automakers, from Detroit to Stuttgart, and for anyone who might, in the foreseeable future. So buckle up, because this is shaping up to be a trade war unlike any we've seen before. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Right, so at the very heart of this glorious international kerfuffle, like the creamy, anxiety-inducing center of a geopolitical stress ball, is the automotive industry. And why, you ask? Well, because it's one of the most absurdly globally integrated and economically vital sectors on the planet. We're talking millions of jobs, not just in dingy factories, but in design studios, marketing departments, and those slightly too enthusiastic car dealerships. These jobs span both continents, which means when you start lobbing tariff grenades, the shrapnel flies everywhere. And the stakes couldn't be bloody higher. It's not just about cars, it's about livelihoods, national pride, and frankly a huge chunk of the global economy. Now enter President Trump stage right, with a proposal that landed with the subtlety of a monster truck rally in a library, tariffs on European-made vehicles. We're talking potentially significant price hikes, the kind that make American consumers look at a shiny new BMW, Volkswagen or Mercedes-Benz and think, maybe I'll just walk, or buy a surprisingly resilient donkey. The idea, ostensibly, was to protect American manufacturing, but the immediate effect would be to make these popular European brands considerably more expensive, thereby hurting their sales in the crucial US market. It's a bit like trying to protect your local bakery by setting fire to the patisserie across the street. It's dramatic, but everyone just ends up with less cake. Naturally, the European Union didn't just sit there sipping espresso and shrugging. Oh no. In response, they started seriously mulling over their own set of tariffs aimed squarely at US manufactured cars. This would, of course, potentially impact American giants like Ford and General Motors, who also sell a not insignificant number of vehicles across the pond. Suddenly, the Made in America sticker starts looking a bit like a target. It's a classic tit for tat, or in this case, tariff for tariff, a playground squabble played out with billions of dollars and entire industries hanging in the balance. You can imagine the scene in boardrooms on both sides of the Atlantic. Industry leaders, people who usually spend their time arguing about horsepower and cup holder design, were suddenly united in a chorus of pleas for the love of all that is holy. Can we just talk this out? They're not wrong. They're staring down the barrel of long-term damage to incredibly complex production networks that have taken decades to build. Think about it. A car isn't made in one place anymore. It's a global Frankenstein's monster of parts and expertise. Tariffs throw a giant spanner in those delicate works. The fear is palpable: market share, painstakingly won over years, could evaporate. Employment, those millions of jobs we mentioned, could be at risk. And it's not just about the big names, it's about the vast ecosystem of suppliers, small businesses that provide everything from seat leather to microchips. These businesses are often the first to feel the squeeze when the giants start to cough. The ripple effects of these tariffs could be devastating, turning bustling factory towns into anxious communities, wondering where the next paycheck will come from. The decisions being made in these high-stakes negotiations, or indeed the lack of them, will do more than just affect next quarter's profits. They will set the tone for the next decade, possibly more, of global trade. We could be witnessing a fundamental reshaping of how the world builds cars, where it builds them, who buys them, and how they are moved from point A to point B. It's a massive gamble, and the entire automotive world is holding its breath, hoping that common sense doesn't get sideswiped by political posturing. And it's not just about the immediate financial hit, is it? It's about innovation. Car makers are already grappling with the monumental shift to electric vehicles, autonomous driving, and increasingly complex environmental regulations. Throwing a trade war into that mix is like asking someone to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle on a tightrope during an earthquake. The resources, both financial and mental, that get diverted to dealing with tariff headaches are resources not being spent on research and development, on making cars safer, cleaner, and, dare I say, better. So, as this automotive drama unfolds, remember it's more than just a pissing contest between governments. It's a critical juncture for an industry that touches almost every aspect of modern life. The outcome of these negotiations, or the escalation into a full-blown trade war, will have consequences that reach far beyond the showroom floor, affecting everything from your commute to the economic stability of entire regions. It's a big deal, a very, very big, potentially very expensive deal. Now let's talk about the bigger picture, because this trade spat isn't just about cars and money. Oh wait, it's mostly about cars and money, but it's also about something a bit more nebulous and arguably more important in the long run: trust. The deepening trade dispute between the United States and the European Union is doing a fantastic job of shredding what has, for the most part, been a remarkably stable and cooperative relationship. Think of it as that old married couple who suddenly start arguing loudly about who left the cap off the toothpaste, except the toothpaste is global economic policy, and the arguing involves billions of dollars in tariffs. For decades, the US and EU have been, if not always best friends, then at least reliable partners. They've built an intricate web of diplomatic and economic ties, a sort of safety net for global stability. The imposition of tariffs by the US, followed by the predictable and entirely understandable EU countermeasures, is like taking a pair of rusty scissors to that very net. Each tariff, each angry press release, erodes decades of accumulated goodwill and mutual understanding. It's a slow, painful unraveling of a partnership that, frankly, the world can ill afford to lose. And for the automotive industry, as we've established, the fallout isn't some abstract diplomatic concern. It's immediate, it's severe, and it's giving CEOs across Europe serious indigestion. European car makers export hundreds of thousands of vehicles to the US every single year. It's a massive market for them. Now imagine slapping a 25% import tariff on those cars. Suddenly, that sleek German sedan or that chic Italian sports car becomes significantly less attractive to the average American consumer, who might start thinking that reliable tariff-free bicycle is looking pretty good. This isn't just about a few lost sales. If these tariffs stick around, or worse, escalate, it could make many European car models simply unaffordable for a large chunk of the American market. What do manufacturers do then? Well, they're not going to just sit on their hands and weep into their croissants. They're going to start looking elsewhere, shifting their focus, their investment and their production to more stable, predictable regions. And guess who's at the top of that list? China and other rapidly growing parts of Asia are waving hello with open arms and potentially fewer tariff-related headaches. If these tensions persist, and honestly right now it looks like they're settling in for a long, uncomfortable winter, the EU might be forced to permanently realign its trade priorities. This isn't just a temporary tantrum. It could be a fundamental shift in global economic gravity. If Europe increasingly looks east for its major trading partnerships, that inevitably means a reduction in US influence, not just in Europe, but in global economic policy making as a whole. The US might find itself shouting into an increasingly empty room. The danger here is a future of diminished cooperation, not just on trade, but on a whole host of global issues that require transatlantic solidarity, climate change, security, technological standards, you name it. When you're busy squabbling over tariffs on camshafts, it's hard to find common ground on much else. It's a classic case of cutting off your nose to spite your face. Except in this scenario, both noses are bleeding profusely, and the face is the global economy. So what's the solution? Well, it's not rocket science, though sometimes it feels like convincing politicians to act rationally is harder than building an actual rocket. Meaningful dialogue, genuine compromise, and a recognition that in a deeply interconnected world, winning a trade war often means everyone loses. Just some lose a bit more slowly. Without this, both the US and EU economies face a future where opportunities are lost, growth is stunted, and the only things that flourish are resentment and mutual suspicion. And it's not just about the big players. Small and medium-sized enterprises, the backbone of both economies, often rely on transatlantic trade. They don't have the resources of a multinational corporation to absorb these tariff shocks or reroute their entire supply chains. They are the silent casualties in this high-level economic chess game, a game where the pieces are businesses and the board is increasingly tilted. The long-term implications are, frankly, rather depressing if cooler heads don't prevail. So, faced with a United States trade policy that's become about as predictable as a toddler with a permanent marker, France is doing what any sensible entity would do. It started to see other people. Economically speaking, of course, the strategy is crystal clear and frankly rather pragmatic. Reduce your vulnerability to US-centric whims and tantrums by building stronger, more diverse economic relationships with other global powers. It's like diversifying your investment portfolio, but instead of stocks and bonds, it's entire countries and trade agreements. Smart, if a little exhausting. And it's not just a vague aspiration. France is actively out there, shaking hands, signing deals, and generally trying to make new friends. Beyond the much-discussed pivot towards China, which we'll get to, France is also putting significant effort into enhancing its relationships with countries in Southeast Asia. Think Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore. These are dynamic, growing economies hungry for investment and partnership. Then there's the Middle East, with its vast sovereign wealth funds and energy resources, and Africa, a continent brimming with untapped potential and a rapidly growing consumer class. France is essentially on a global diplomatic speed dating tour. For the automotive sector, this isn't just about finding a safe harbor to weather the storm of US tariffs. No, it's far more proactive than that. It's about opening entirely new doors, finding new markets and tapping into different innovation ecosystems. Emerging markets, by their very definition, offer new consumer bases. Millions of people who are buying their first car or upgrading represent a huge opportunity for French, and by extension, European automakers, who might be facing a chillier reception in the US. It's a numbers game, and the numbers in these emerging markets are looking increasingly attractive. But it's not just about selling more Peugeots and Renaults. These regions are also becoming hubs for technological innovation. Think about advancements in battery technology in Asia, or mobile payment systems in Africa that are leapfrogging traditional banking. By forging closer ties, French companies can gain access to these innovations, participate in joint ventures, and ensure they remain at the cutting edge. It's a two-way street. They bring automotive expertise, and their new partners bring fresh perspectives and local market knowledge. If this strategic pivot is successful, and it's a big if requiring sustained diplomatic and economic effort, it could make French and European automakers significantly more resilient. They'd be less dependent on the whims of any single market, particularly one as currently volatile as the US. Imagine a global automotive industry where European brands have strong footholds not just in their traditional markets, but across Asia, Africa and South America. This would make them formidable global competitors, regardless of what's happening in the transatlantic relationship. This diversification isn't just a defensive move, it's an offensive one. It's about positioning for future growth in a world where economic power is becoming increasingly multipolar. France, and by extension the EU, seems to have recognized that relying too heavily on the old playbook, the one centered around a US-Europe axis, is no longer a sustainable strategy in the 21st century. The game is changing, and they're trying to change with it, even if it means learning some new, complicated rules. Of course, this isn't without its challenges. Building deep economic ties with diverse nations, each with its own political systems, regulatory environments and cultural nuances, is a monumental task. It requires patience, investment, and a willingness to adapt. There will be setbacks, deals that fall through, and partnerships that don't live up to their initial promise. But the alternative, remaining overly exposed to a single, unpredictable trading partner, is increasingly seen as the riskier option. So, as France casts its economic net wider, it's signalling a broader shift in European thinking. It's a quiet acknowledgement that the old certainties of the post-Cold War world are fading, and that in this new, more complex global landscape, agility and diversity are the keys to survival and perhaps even prosperity. The French automotive industry is in many ways a test case for this new approach. Its success or failure will have implications far beyond the borders of France. All right, so now it's crucial to understand that France, while definitely being the loudest and perhaps most theatrically Gallic in its indignation, is not acting alone in this trade drama. This isn't some solo performance of Les Miserables with Tariffs as the barricades. The broader European Union, that sprawling, often complicated but ultimately powerful bloc of nations, is visibly closing ranks. It's like when one sibling gets picked on and suddenly all the other siblings who were just moments ago arguing over the TV remote unite against the common bully. Or in this case, the common tariff imposer. President Macron of France has been particularly vocal, practically grabbing the megaphone at every EU summit to advocate for a strong, coordinated EU response. He's framed the US actions not just as an economic affront, but as a form of protectionist overreach by Washington, a dangerous lurch away from the principles of free and fair trade that, ironically, the US itself championed for decades. He's essentially accusing the US of forgetting its own rulebook and trying to rewrite it mid-game, which, as any board game enthusiast will tell you, is deeply unsporting. And the EU, bless its bureaucratic heart, has a history of standing firm in trade disputes. It might take them a while to agree on the exact shade of beige for the new office carpets, but when it comes to trade, they can be surprisingly resolute. This time appears to be no different. They've seen this movie before. A large trading partner tries to throw its weight around, and they generally don't enjoy the ending where they just roll over. The EU, as a collective, is a massive economic power, and it knows it. Think about it. Europe's automotive industry isn't just a nice-to-have, it's a fundamental pillar of its entire economy. We're talking millions of jobs, not just in Germany, France and Italy, but across the continent, from component manufacturers in Eastern Europe to design houses in Scandinavia. It generates billions upon billions in export revenue. When you threaten something that's central to Europe's economic well-being, you can expect a robust and potentially rather angry response. The stakes are simply too high for them to just say, oh well, c'est la vie. With stakes this high, Brussels, the de facto capital of the EU, is meticulously exploring a whole range of retaliatory options. This isn't just idle chatter over moles frites, they are drawing up lists, checking them twice, and figuring out which US goods could be targeted with their own set of tariffs. The goal would be to inflict just enough economic pain to bring Washington back to the negotiating table, without ideally triggering an all-out, mutually destructive trade apocalypse. It's a delicate balancing act, like trying to defuse a bomb while wearing oven mitts. While diplomatic negotiations are, at least officially, still ongoing, there are always hushed conversations in quiet corridors. The groundwork is undeniably being laid for a potential full-scale trade war. This wouldn't just be a minor skirmish. It could be a prolonged conflict that fundamentally redraws global trade routes, shatters existing supply chains, and sends shockwaves through financial markets. We could see a world increasingly divided into rival economic blocs, each with its own set of rules and alliances. The unity of the EU in this matter is itself a significant geopolitical statement. It shows that despite internal disagreements on other issues, and believe me, there are plenty, when faced with what they perceive as an external economic threat, they can and will pull together. This collective resolve makes the EU a much more formidable opponent than any single member state acting alone. It's the difference between facing one moderately annoyed badger and an entire swarm of highly organized, strategically minded badgers. The big question, of course, is whether this united front will be enough to de-escalate the situation, or if it will simply provoke further retaliation from the US, leading to an ever-increasing spiral of tariffs and counter-tariffs. The global economy is watching, and frankly, it's biting its nails down to the quick. The prospect of a trade war between two of the world's largest economic blocs is not something anyone, apart from perhaps a few disaster capitalists, is looking forward to. Chapter 5. The Supply Chain Scramble, when steel and aluminum give Europe a migraine. All right, let's get down to the nitty-gritty, the real-world consequences of these grand geopolitical chess moves. The US tariffs on steel and aluminum, the ones that kicked off France's feisty response, aren't just some abstract economic burden that number crunchers worry about. No, for industries like automaking, they are a logistical nightmare, a throbbing migraine that refuses to go away with a couple of aspirins. They throw a massive, rusty wrench into the incredibly complex machinery of modern manufacturing. You see, Europe's auto supply chain is, or at least was, a finely tuned masterpiece of global cooperation. It's a delicate ecosystem that depends on the predictable, efficient, and relatively unhindered cross-border flow of materials, components, and finished goods. Steel from one country, aluminum from another, electronics from halfway across the world, all converging in factories to become the cars we drive. Tariffs, however, are the antithesis of this harmony. They introduce uncertainty, they add costs at multiple points, and they generally make everyone's life more difficult and expensive. Consider the words of Guillaume Faury, the CEO of Airbus. Now, Airbus makes planes, not cars, but his point reverberates right through the transportation sector. He suggested that if transatlantic trade becomes too expensive, too choked by tariffs and counter-tariffs, Airbus might have to prioritize its non-US clients. Think about that. A major European manufacturer essentially saying, look, America, if you make this too hard, we'll just sell our very expensive toys to someone else. The implications for automakers who operate on similar global scales are stark and deeply worrying. Automakers across Europe are now in full-on crisis mode, forced to re-evaluate their sourcing and production strategies. These are strategies that were likely years in the making, based on assumptions of relatively stable trade. Now, it's all up in the air. Some might be looking to relocate factories, a hugely expensive and disruptive undertaking. Others will be desperately trying to diversify their suppliers, hoping to find sources of steel and aluminum that aren't subject to these new punitive tariffs. Some might even, heaven forbid, have to scale back operations in the US altogether if it simply becomes unprofitable. And it's not just the manufacturers feeling the pinch. If the cost of raw materials like steel and aluminum goes up, and with tariffs they inevitably do, then the cost of producing a car goes up. Manufacturers can absorb some of that, sure. They can tighten their belts, squeeze their suppliers, maybe cut back on the free coffee in the break room, but eventually those increased costs have to go somewhere. And somewhere usually means the price tag on the showroom floor, which in turn means you, the consumer, end up paying more. Now, what happens when cars become more expensive? Well, unless everyone suddenly got a massive pay raise they forgot to tell me about, demand is likely to drop. People will delay buying a new car, they'll opt for a used one, or they'll just keep their old banger running for another year. This creates yet another crisis for automakers who are already grappling with incredibly tight profit margins, the massive investment required for electrification, and fierce global competition. It's a perfect storm of financial woes. The ripple effects extend throughout the entire supply chain. It's not just the big car brands, it's the thousands of smaller companies that supply them with everything from engine parts to upholstery. These smaller players often have less leverage and fewer resources to weather these storms. A tariff on steel can mean a small metal stamping company suddenly faces ruin, which then has knock-on effects for the larger assembler who relied on their parts. It's a domino effect, and the dominoes are spread all across Europe. So these steel and aluminum tariffs, which might have sounded like a targeted measure to some, have unleashed a cascade of unintended and deeply problematic consequences for one of Europe's most vital industries. It's a stark reminder that in our interconnected global economy, you can't just tweak one part of the system without sending vibrations and often outright tremors through the rest of it. The auto industry is currently feeling those tremors and hoping the whole building doesn't come down. Chapter 6. The panda in the room. France and Europe cozy up to China. With the transatlantic relationship currently resembling a particularly awkward family dinner where Uncle Sam has offended everyone, it's hardly surprising that France and indeed much of Europe is increasingly turning its gaze eastward, specifically towards the rather large economically powerful panda in the room, China. As tensions with the US rise, strengthening economic ties with China is no longer just an option. It's becoming a strategic imperative, a way to diversify partnerships and reduce an unhealthy reliance on an increasingly unpredictable United States. The numbers themselves tell a pretty compelling story. Bilateral trade between France and China, for instance, hit a staggering $78.9 billion in 2023. Now that's a lot of French wine and cheese heading east, and a lot of Chinese manufactured goods heading west. To put that in perspective, it marks a nearly 800-fold increase since the two countries formally established relations some 6 decades ago. That's not just growth, that's an economic explosion, and it shows no signs of slowing down, especially not now. Remember, President Emmanuel Macron's high-profile visit to Beijing in April 2023? That wasn't just a fancy photo opportunity and a chance to sample some excellent Peking duck. No, that trip was all business, leading to the signing of 18 strategic agreements across a whole host of industries. We're talking aviation, agriculture, and crucially for our purposes, automotive technology. This wasn't just diplomatic fluff. It was laying concrete foundations for deeper economic integration between France and the world's second largest economy. This eastward pivot, particularly for the automotive sector, opens up a treasure trove of opportunities. China has a massive and still growing consumer base. For French automakers looking to offset potential losses in the US market or simply expand their global footprint, China is an unmissable target. Furthermore, this closer relationship can pave the way for more joint ventures, allowing French companies to leverage local expertise and navigate the complexities of the Chinese market, while also facilitating technology sharing. A two-way street that can benefit both sides. And let's talk about the elephant, or rather, the electric vehicle in the room. China is, to put it mildly, a global powerhouse in electric vehicle EV, battery production, and EV technology in general. They are miles ahead in terms of scale, cost-effectiveness, and innovation in certain areas. For French and other European automakers who are desperately trying to stay competitive in the global EV race, a partnership with Chinese firms, or at least closer access to their technology and supply chains, is incredibly attractive. It's like being an aspiring chef and getting invited to cook in the world's best-equipped kitchen. In this current climate of transatlantic frostiness and global economic uncertainty, this kind of diversification isn't just a smart business strategy, it's rapidly becoming a matter of survival. Relying too heavily on one market, one supplier, or one political alliance is a recipe for disaster when that one thing becomes unstable. By strengthening ties with China, France is essentially hedging its bets, ensuring it has other powerful friends to call upon if things with its old pal America continue to sour. Of course, this strategic shift isn't without its own set of complexities and potential pitfalls. Doing business with China comes with its own unique challenges. Concerns about intellectual property, market access, geopolitical sensitivities, and human rights. European leaders are not naive about these issues. However, the calculus seems to be shifting. The perceived risks of engaging more deeply with China, especially when faced with US protectionism, are starting to outweigh the risks of engagement. So, as the US and Europe bicker over tariffs, China is quietly, or perhaps not so quietly, consolidating its position as an indispensable global economic partner. France's move to strengthen these ties is a clear signal that the old world order is changing, and that European nations are prepared to forge new alliances to secure their economic future, even if it means navigating a more complex and at times uncomfortable geopolitical landscape. The automotive industry is right at the forefront of this strategic recalibration. Chapter 7, France says none. To US tariffs, the retaliation rodeo begins, all right? Let's rewind the tape a bit, back to early 2025, a time when the phrase trade war was moving from think tank papers to headline news with alarming speed. Under the administration of President Donald Trump, a man not exactly known for his shy and retiring approach to international commerce, the United States decided to impose a rather hefty 25% tariff on imported steel and aluminum. The official line, as it often is in these situations, was that this was all about bolstering American manufacturing and, of course, the ever-versatile justification of national security. Because apparently, Canadian aluminum is a clear and present danger to the Republic. This move, predictably, was met with swift and widespread condemnation from some of America's key allies, who saw it less as a legitimate security measure and more as well a thinly veiled act of economic aggression. Imagine inviting your friends over for dinner and then charging them a 25% cutlery usage fee. It doesn't tend to go down well. And among the first to push back with a certain Gallic flair and a firm absolument pas was France. They were not about to take this lying down. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, a name you should probably get used to hearing, stepped up to the microphone and made it abundantly clear that neither France nor, by extension, the European Union would remain passive spectators while their key industries were being targeted by US protectionism. He essentially drew a line in the sand, or perhaps more appropriately, a line in the Beaujolais. The message was unambiguous. You hit us, we will hit you back. This wasn't a polite diplomatic protest. This was the sound of gauntlets being thrown down. And they weren't kidding. Within days and for government action, days is practically light speed, France announced its own set of retaliatory measures. They weren't just going to send a strongly worded letter. They were preparing to deploy their own economic artillery. This signalled, in no uncertain terms, that France, and likely the EU behind it, would not tolerate policies that they believed jeopardized European competitiveness and undermined the principles of fair international trade. The era of polite disagreement was officially over. Now, why all the fuss about steel and aluminum? Well, these tariffs directly and painfully impact sectors like automotive and aerospace, two absolute titans of European industry. These sectors rely heavily, almost existentially, on affordable and uninterrupted supplies of high-quality steel and aluminum. Think about it, you can't build a car without steel, you can't build a modern airplane without aluminum. These aren't luxury add-ons, they are fundamental building blocks. For automakers, the equation is brutally simple. Higher material costs mean thinner profit margins. If the price of steel and aluminum spikes because of tariffs, then production expenses inevitably go up. Manufacturers then face a horrible choice: either absorb those costs and watch their profits evaporate, or pass them on to consumers in the form of more expensive vehicles. And as we know, more expensive vehicles often mean fewer sales, leading to a downward spiral of economic woe. France's response, therefore, was far more than just symbolic. It wasn't just a Gallic shrug and a muttered complaint. It was a powerful, tangible message sent across the Atlantic. Europe will not allow its industrial base, the foundation of its prosperity, to be undercut and undermined without significant consequences. This was the first shot in what threatened to become a much larger, much messier conflict. This initial swift and decisive retaliation by France set the stage for everything that followed. It demonstrated a willingness to escalate, to meet force with force in the economic arena. It showed that the EU, often perceived as slow and bureaucratic, could, when sufficiently provoked, act with surprising speed and unity, especially when core economic interests were at stake. The US had fired the first tariff, but France made it clear they wouldn't be the last. Chapter 8. So are we all doomed or just mildly inconvenienced? The future of trade? Well, there you have it. France's bold, some might say borderline audacious, defiance in the face of US tariffs has well and truly kicked the hornet's nest, triggering a ripple effect that could, and likely will, alter global trade dynamics for years, if not decades to come. This isn't just a passing squall, it's looking more like a fundamental climate change in the world of international economics. As the European Union, spurred on by French resolve, pivots towards new alliances and seriously considers a full shopping list of retaliatory measures, the automotive industry, that global giant, finds itself squarely at a very bumpy crossroads. Manufacturers on both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed around the world, are now scrambling. They're frantically trying to reconfigure supply chains that took ages to build. They're pouring money into innovation, not just for better cars, but to cut costs anywhere they can. And they're desperately trying to maintain consumer confidence, even as the threat of rising prices looms large. If this standoff escalates further, and let's be honest, the signs aren't exactly pointing towards a group hug anytime soon, Europe may well deepen its ties with China and other emerging economies, potentially further isolating the United States in an increasingly complex network of global trade. The multi-trillion-dollar question remains, can the US and the EU, two historic allies and economic behemoths, actually find a way to resolve their differences before this escalates into a full-scale, mutually destructive trade war? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a long-term industry shift, a painful realignment that will redefine the global automotive landscape as we know it? Honestly, your guess is as good as ours, but it's going to be a fascinating, if terrifying, watch. Let us know your thoughts, your fears, your predictions down in the comments. And if you want to stay ahead of the curve on everything impacting the global auto world, and who doesn't, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned to Power and Policy. Thanks for watching, and try not to have nightmares about tariffs. See you next time.